The evening rush at La Blanche was in full swing, with the clinking of fine china and the soft murmur of conversations filling the air. Between the pristine white tables, a young woman moved with quiet grace, her steps measured and precise as she balanced plates of expertly crafted dishes. This was Min, known to her coworkers as the quiet one with the gentle smile. At just 23, she had mastered the art of being almost invisible while somehow being everywhere at once. Regular customers had come to appreciate her subtle presence, the way she'd anticipate their needs before they even realized them, how she'd appear with fresh water just as their glasses ran low, and her uncanny ability to remember their preferences from visits months ago. The other servers often wondered about her. During breaks, while they'd chat about their weekend plans or share complaints about difficult customers, Min would sit slightly apart, her fingers tapping an unknown rhythm on the break room table. Sometimes, when the restaurant's background music played certain classical pieces, her eyes would take on a faraway look, as if she were somewhere else entirely. What none of her coworkers knew was that those moments transported her back to a grand concert hall in Beijing, where magnificent crystal chandeliers hung from ornate ceilings, and the polished wood of a Steinway grand piano gleamed under the spotlights. They couldn't see the younger Min, dressed in a simple black dress, her hair neatly pulled back, taking her seat at that piano while an audience of hundreds held their breath. Tonight, like every other night, she worked her double shift with unwavering focus. Between serving courses at table 7 and taking orders at table 12, she mentally calculated her tips, adding them to her community college savings. The restaurant's dim lighting couldn't hide the slight shadows under her eyes, evidence of late nights spent studying after long days on her feet. In the kitchen, she moved with the same precision she once applied to her piano scales. Each plate was a new measure in an endless symphony of service. Appetizers flowing seamlessly into main courses, desserts providing the final flourish to each table's dining experience. The weight of the plates had strengthened her hands in a way quite different from years of piano practice, but she approached both with the same dedication. When the soft notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata drifted from the restaurant's sound system, Min's hands moved ever so slightly as she arranged silverware, her muscle memory translating the music into phantom keystrokes. An observant guest might notice how she placed each fork and knife with the precise timing of the piece, though she seemed unaware of it herself. The other servers had their own theories about her. Some thought she was just shy, others suspected she was working through some personal tragedy. The truth was both simpler and more complex. Within this efficient server was an artist in hibernation, a musician who had once made audiences weep with her interpretations of Chopin and Liszt. As she cleared a table near the baby grand piano that sat largely unused in the corner of the dining room, Min allowed herself a brief glance at its polished surface. In its reflection, she caught a glimpse of her uniform, so different from the concert attire she once wore. She quickly looked away, focusing instead on the task at hand, pushing down the familiar ache that arose whenever she got too close to a piano. The night continued its usual rhythm: greet, serve, clear, repeat. Min moved through it all with practiced ease, her true passion hidden behind a professional smile. She was good at keeping secrets, especially the one about the countless hours she'd spent practicing scales and arpeggios, the competitions she'd won, and the dreams she'd carefully packed away when reality demanded a different path. Little did she know that this ordinary evening was about to take an extraordinary turn, one that would challenge everything she accepted about her new life. The usual calm of LeBlanc's private dining room had transformed into something more vibrant that evening. Mr. Patel, a man whose silver hair and tailored suit spoke of success, but whose warm eyes held genuine kindness, had reserved the entire space. He wasn't just any wealthy businessman. He was the kind who remembered the names of janitors and always held doors open for others, despite his billions. Tonight, he was hosting a celebration for his music education foundation, which had just opened its 10th free music school for underprivileged children. Around the elegantly set tables sat a mix of accomplished musicians, education leaders, and longtime supporters of the arts. The air buzzed with conversation about changing young lives through music. Men had been assigned to their section, a task that would have normally been given to more senior staff. But the regular server had called in sick, and she was known for her reliability. As she approached the room, she could hear the gentle notes of classical music floating through the partially open door. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized the piece. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the very piece she had played at her last recital in Beijing. Mr. Patel noticed her the moment she entered. There was something different about this server, he thought. While other staff members sometimes seemed intimidated by the wealthy crowd, she moved through the room with quiet confidence. Her movements were precise, almost musical, as if she were following an internal rhythm. As she poured water for the guests, someone mentioned Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1. Min's hand trembled slightly, just for a moment, but Mr. Patel caught it. He watched as her fingers, holding the water pitcher, unconsciously moved in perfect time with the background music. A conductor at the table was discussing the technical challenges of the piece, and Mr. Patel noticed how Min's expression changed ever so slightly, as if she wanted to add something to the conversation. During the main course service, the discussion turned to a famous pianist's recent interpretation of Bach. Mr. Patel observed how Min slowed her pace just slightly when passing that particular conversation, her ear tilted toward the speakers. It wasn't the obvious eavesdropping of someone starstruck by celebrity diners. It was the unconscious reaction of someone who understood exactly what they were talking about. The evening progressed, and Mr. Patel's curiosity grew. He watched as Min arranged plates with the same precision he'd seen in professional musicians arranging their sheet music. When she wasn't serving, her fingers would sometimes move at her side, following the melody of whatever piece was playing through the restaurant's speakers. During dessert, one guest asked about the beautiful grand piano in the main dining room. "Does anyone ever play it?" she wondered aloud. Min, who was clearing plates nearby, held her breath for just a moment too long. Mr. Patel, who had made his fortune noticing the small details others missed, didn't fail to catch this reaction. As coffee was being served, the conversation turned to music education in Asia. Mr. Patel noticed how Min's movements became more measured, more controlled, as if she were trying extra hard not to react to the discussion about Chinese conservatories. When someone mentioned the prestigious Beijing Central Conservatory, he saw her hands clench ever so slightly around the coffee pot. Mr. Patel had built his success on understanding people, not just their words, but their silences, their small gestures, the things they tried to hide. Everything about this quiet server spoke of someone intimately familiar with the world of classical music. He recognized the signs because he'd spent decades around musicians. The way she moved to the rhythm of background music, her subtle reactions to their conversations, the unconscious conductor's grip she used on serving spoons. These weren't coincidences. As the evening drew to a close, Mr. Patel made his decision. He had built his foundation on the belief that extraordinary talent could be found anywhere, and his instincts were telling him he'd just found something remarkable. He just needed to find the right way to draw it out. As the private dinner party began winding down, Mr. Patel watched Min clear the last of the dessert plates. The background music had shifted to Chopin's waltz in D-flat major, and he noticed how her movements perfectly matched the rhythm of the piece. It wasn't just good service anymore. It was an unconscious dance that spoke of years of musical training. The other guests were gathering their belongings, exchanging business cards and warm handshakes, when Mr. Patel decided to make his move. He gestured to Min as she passed by with a tray of empty coffee cups. "Excuse me," he said kindly, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him famous in business circles for putting people at ease. "I couldn't help but notice something interesting throughout dinner." Min paused, her hands steady on the tray, but her eyes showing a flicker of uncertainty. The remaining guests, curious about their host's interest in the quiet server, fell silent. The background music seemed to grow louder in the sudden quiet, Chopin's gentle notes filling the space between words. Your fingers, Mr. Padel continued, gesturing to her hands. They've been conducting every classical piece that's played tonight. And just now, with the waltz in D-flat major, you were moving exactly in time with the rubato passages. He smiled as he saw her eyes widen slightly at his use of the musical term. You're a pianist, aren't you? Min's grip on the tray tightened almost imperceptibly. For a moment, she seemed to be struggling with whether to maintain her professional distance or acknowledge the truth. The other servers, who had been clearing nearby tables, slowed their work to listen. She began, then paused, choosing her words carefully. I used to play. A long time ago. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying the slight hint of an accent she usually tried to hide. Mr. Patel glanced at the grand piano in the main dining room, visible through the open doors. Used to? He asked gently. Music isn't something we stop carrying in our hearts. I saw how you looked at that piano earlier, the way a painter looks at a canvas or a writer at a blank page. The remaining dinner guests were now openly watching the exchange. One of them, a renowned music professor, leaned forward with interest. Min stood very still, the tray in her hands becoming a shield between herself and their attention. There's a saying in my family, Mr. Padel continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing wisdom passed down through generations. Talent doesn't disappear. It just waits for its moment to shine again. He gestured toward the piano. Would you play something for us? Min's face showed a complex mix of emotions. Longing, fear, and something else. Perhaps hope. I couldn't, she said, but her eyes betrayed her, drifting toward the piano with unmistakable yearning. I haven't played in years, and I'm working. Mr. Patel stood up, his presence commanding but not intimidating. Let me make it interesting, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket for his checkbook. If you play just one piece, any piece you choose, I'll donate $10,000 to any music education charity you select. He paused, then added with a gentle smile, and I suspect your manager won't mind, considering he's been standing in the doorway for the past 5 minutes. Indeed, the restaurant manager was there, watching with undisguised curiosity. Other diners in the main room had begun to notice the unusual scene unfolding. The background music seemed to fade away, as if even it was waiting to see what would happen next. Min looked at the tray in her hands, then at the piano, then back at Mr. Patel. His eyes held no judgment, no pressure, just genuine interest and encouragement. In that moment, she felt the weight of every day she'd walked past that piano without touching it. Every time she'd pushed down the urge to play when she heard classical music, every dream she'd forced herself to set aside. The chef had stepped out of the kitchen now, and several other servers had gathered near the doors. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her decision. Mr. Patel's checkbook lay open on the table, but they all knew this moment was about something far more valuable than money. The world seemed to shrink around Min as she stood there, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The familiar weight of the serving tray in her hands suddenly felt foreign, and her fingers tingled with a sensation she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 3 years, the sensation of wanting to play. She looked at the piano across the room, the beautiful grand piano she'd walked past hundreds of times, always keeping a safe distance, as if getting too close might break the careful walls she'd built around her old life. Now, those walls were crumbling, and memories flooded in like a spring tide. Her mind drifted to the last time she touched piano keys. It was in the hospital waiting room in Beijing, while her father was undergoing his 3rd surgery. The old upright piano there was out of tune, its middle C slightly flat, but she played anyway. She remembered how the elderly woman waiting for news about her grandson had cried, not from sadness, but because the music had given her hope. That was the day they'd received the final bill for her father's treatment. The number had more zeros than their family's savings could cover, and she'd known, sitting on that worn piano bench, that her time at the conservatory was over. She'd withdrawn the next day, sold her piano the day after, and within a week, she was on a plane to America with nothing but determination and a student visa. Now, in the hushed restaurant, she could feel everyone's eyes on her. A busboy who had always been kind to her gave an encouraging nod. The stern-faced chef, who rarely left his kitchen during service, stood in his doorway with arms crossed but eyes gentle. Her manager, usually so proper and reserved, had an almost childlike curiosity in his expression. Min's hands trembled slightly as she set down the serving tray. The familiar scent of lemon polish from the piano wafted across the room, bringing with it memories of countless hours of practice, of competitions where judges sat with stern faces and pens, poised to note every mistake, of moments when the music had flowed through her like pure light. She started to say, but her voice caught. She cleared her throat and tried again. The piano might not be in tune. It was a weak excuse, and she knew it. She'd overheard the tuner just last week, watching from the corner of her eye as he'd worked his magic on the strings. Mr. Patel smiled knowingly. "It was tuned recently," he said softly. "But you already knew that, didn't you? You've been paying attention to everything about that piano since you started working here." He was right. She had memorized the sound of every note that drifted from it during the rare times other people played. She knew exactly how the afternoon sun hit its polished surface, how the lid stayed up at exactly the same angle, how the bench needed to be adjusted just slightly to the right for proper positioning. A young girl dining with her parents whispered loudly, "Is she going to play?" The child's innocent curiosity cut through Min's hesitation like a warm knife through butter. She remembered being that young, seeing a piano for the first time, feeling that same wonder. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Music is not just what we do, little one. It's who we are." She had believed him then, practicing until her fingers ached, loving every minute of it. When had she stopped believing? The weight of her serving apron suddenly felt too heavy. With trembling fingers, she untied it, folded it carefully, and placed it on a nearby table. Someone gasped softly. It was the first time anyone at the restaurant had seen her without it. Without that barrier, she felt strangely exposed, but also lighter, more like her old self. 3 years. 3 years of walking past pianos in shop windows, of turning off classical radio stations because they hurt too much to hear, of typing college essays with fingers that remembered a different kind of keyboard. 3 years of pretending she was just another server, just another student, just another immigrant chasing a practical dream. Mr. Patel's checkbook still lay open on the table, but Min barely saw it. Instead, she saw her father's face the first time she played Chopin perfectly, saw her mother's tears at her first recital, saw all the moments when music had been as natural as breathing. The question wasn't whether she could play after all this time. The question was how she had managed not to play for so long. The walk to the piano felt like floating in a dream. Each step brought Min closer to the moment she'd both longed for and dreaded. The polished black surface of the grand piano reflected the warm restaurant lighting, making it glow like a living thing waiting for her touch. As she adjusted the bench, muscle memory took over. Her hands found the perfect height without thinking, just as they had done thousands of times before. The familiar sensation of the cool, smooth keys beneath her fingertips sent a small shiver through her body. The restaurant had fallen so quiet that she could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. Min closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and let her fingers rest lightly on the keys. In that instant, 3 years of distance melted away. Her hands remembered. They had always remembered. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the air, soft and hesitant at first, like raindrops before a storm. Then, as if the music itself had been waiting all this time to burst free, it grew. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence, drawing out the melody that had lived in her heart through all the silent years. A wine glass clinked somewhere in the restaurant, but Min barely heard it. She was lost in the music now, her whole body swaying slightly as she played. The powerful chords of the first movement rolled out across the dining room like waves, and she remembered why she had fallen in love with this piece as a child. It was like telling a story without words. Near the kitchen, a young waiter stood with his mouth slightly open, the plates in his hands completely forgotten. The chef had pulled out his phone to record the moment, but his hands were shaking so much that the video would later be almost unwatchable. Mr. Patel sat perfectly still, his eyes closed, a single tear rolling down his cheek. As Min moved into the second movement, her fingers danced across the keys with the delicacy of butterfly wings. The melancholic melody soared through the restaurant, touching something deep and human in everyone who heard it. An elderly couple held hands tighter, remembering their first dance. A businessman in an expensive suit quietly wiped his eyes, thinking of the piano lessons his mother had insisted on when he was young. The music built and swelled, her hands flying across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone who hadn't played in years. But this wasn't about technique anymore. This was about every emotion she'd bottled up, every dream she'd put aside, every moment she'd walked past this piano pretending it didn't call to her. In the corner, a small girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "The piano lady looks like she's flying." And in a way she was. Min's hands lifted and descended, her fingers finding each note perfectly, her whole body moving with the music as if gravity had lost its hold on her. As she approached the final movement, tears streamed freely down her face, but her playing never faltered. The powerful crescendo filled every corner of the restaurant, making water glasses vibrate and hearts race. This wasn't just a performance. It was a declaration, a return, a homecoming. The last notes hung in the air like stars, slowly fading into a silence so complete you could hear the rain that had started falling outside. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Min sat at the piano, her hands still hovering over the keys, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Then, from somewhere in the back of the restaurant, someone started to clap. The sound was joined by another, then another, until the whole room was filled with applause. But Min barely heard it. All she could hear was her father's voice from years ago. Music is who we are. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt completely, truly herself again. The applause finally faded, but its warmth lingered in the air. Min's hands rested in her lap, no longer trembling. She felt lighter somehow, as if playing those notes had lifted a weight she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Mr. Patel approached the piano slowly, giving her time to collect herself. He pulled up a chair, his movements gentle and unhurried, like someone approaching a deer in the woods. The other diners remained quiet, sensing that they were witnessing something important. "That was Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto," he said softly. "Not exactly a casual piece for someone who used to play." His voice held no accusation, only genuine curiosity and warmth. Min looked down at her hands, servers' hands now, with small calluses from carrying trays, a tiny burn from a hot plate last week. But tonight they had remembered their first life, their true purpose. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself talk about it. "I started playing when I was 4, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "In our apartment in Beijing, we had an old upright piano that my father had bought secondhand. It was terribly out of tune, but he saved for 6 months to buy it because he saw how I would press the keys on my toy keyboard in perfect time with the music on radio." The restaurant manager had pulled up a chair now too, and other staff members gathered nearby, finally learning the story of their quiet colleague. Min's voice grew stronger as she continued. "By the time I was 12, I was performing in competitions. At 16, I got into the Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing." A small smile touched her lips at the memory. "My parents were so proud. My father worked 2 jobs to pay for my lessons. My mother sewed all my performance dresses by hand. She ran her fingers lightly over the piano keys, not pressing them, just feeling their smooth surface. Everything was perfect. I was going to be a concert pianist. That was the plan, the dream. Her voice caught slightly. Then my father got sick. The young girl who had watched her play earlier made a small sound of sympathy. Her mother shushed her gently, but Min gave the child a tender smile. It started with headaches, then dizziness. The doctors found. She paused, gathering strength. They found a tumor. The surgery was expensive. Very expensive. Then there were complications, and he needed more surgeries. Each word seemed to cost her something, but also seemed to heal something. We sold everything we could. My mother's jewelry. Our car. But it wasn't enough. The day I withdrew from the conservatory, my teachers begged me to stay. They offered partial scholarships, but she shook her head. Family comes first. It always comes first. Mr. Patel's eyes were filled with understanding. So you came to America? Min nodded. My English was good. I had a cousin in the city who helped me find this job. I enrolled in community college. Accounting. She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. It's very different from music, but it will help me support my family. And your father? Someone asked softly. A genuine smile brightened Min's face. He recovered. The last surgery was successful. He's teaching mathematics again now, part-time. Her eyes grew distant. But the medical bills, they'll take years to pay off. That's why I'm here, working double shifts, studying whenever I can. The chef, still standing in his doorway, cleared his throat gruffly. 3 years, he said. You've worked here 3 years, and all this time. All this time you had this gift, the restaurant manager finished, shaking his head in wonder. Min looked at the piano again, her eyes reflecting both love and pain. I told myself it was better not to play it all than to play when I couldn't give it my whole heart. Better to lock it away than to feel it slipping through my fingers. She touched the keys again, this time pressing one softly, letting a single clear note ring out. But tonight, I remembered something my father always said. Music isn't what we do, it's who we are. The note faded away, but the truth of her words hung in the air. Everyone in the room understood that they had witnessed not just an amazing performance, but a moment of healing, of coming back to oneself. The next morning, Min arrived at the restaurant to find a small crowd gathered outside. Her first thought was that something had gone wrong, but then she noticed their smiles. The young girl from the night before waved excitedly from behind her mother's legs. Inside, the restaurant had been transformed. The manager stood proudly next to a newly mounted plaque beside the grand piano. In elegant letters, it read, "Music lives in unexpected places. All are welcome to play." Below that was a smaller note, inspired by an extraordinary performance. Mr. Patel was there too, talking quietly with a group of people Min didn't recognize. When he saw her, his face lit up with that same warm smile from the night before. "Ah, perfect timing," he said, walking over to greet her. "I hope you don't mind, but I made a few calls last night. I couldn't sleep. Kept hearing that Rachmaninoff in my head." He gestured to the group he'd been speaking with. "These are the board members of my foundation. We had an emergency meeting this morning." He pulled out an envelope from his jacket. "This is for you." Min's hands shook as she opened it. Inside wasn't just the promised check for $10,000. There was something else. A letter. As she read it, her eyes grew wide. "It's not just a scholarship," Mr. Patel explained to the onlookers. "We're creating an entirely new program. The Unexpected Talents Initiative." His eyes twinkled. "You're our first recipient, if you want it. Full tuition at any music school of your choice, plus living expenses. And," he paused for effect, "complete coverage of your father's remaining medical bills." The young girl from last night clapped her hands in delight. "The piano lady can play forever now," she exclaimed, making everyone laugh. Min pressed the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. The chef appeared from the kitchen, breaking his usual stern demeanor to give her a quick, gruff hug. "Don't worry," he said. "You can still work here part-time. That piano needs someone who understands it." Over the next few months, the restaurant's atmosphere changed. The piano was no longer just decoration. During quiet afternoons, Min would give lessons to interested staff members. The young busboy turned out to have a natural talent. The stern chef revealed that he always wanted to learn. Word spread through the city. Other restaurants and businesses started looking at their own employees differently, wondering what hidden talents might be waiting to emerge. Mr. Patel's foundation received hundreds of applications from people with similar stories. Dreams put aside for practical needs, talents hidden beneath everyday jobs. 1 year later, Min stood on a proper stage for the first time in 4 years. The concert hall was packed. In the front row sat her parents, flown in from Beijing. Her father, healthy now, beamed with pride. Her mother clutched a handkerchief, already crying happy tears before the performance even began. Mr. Patel sat with them, along with several people from the restaurant. The chef had closed the kitchen early, an unprecedented event. The young girl who had witnessed that first performance was there too, now taking piano lessons herself. But most importantly, scattered throughout the audience were dozens of other scholarship recipients. The waitress who turned out to be a brilliant violinist, the janitor who had given up opera singing to support his family, the bus driver who once studied at Juilliard. Each of them had their own story, their own moment of return to their true passion. As Min sat at the piano, adjusting the bench just so, she remembered that night in the restaurant. How scared she had been, how the music had called her back to herself. She looked out at the audience, at all these faces that understood exactly what this moment meant. Her fingers touched the keys, and once again, Rachmaninoff filled the air. But this time, there was no hesitation, no fear. This time, she played not just with skill, but with the joy of someone who had found their way home. And somewhere in the back of the hall, a new server at some other restaurant listened and thought about the guitar they'd packed away years ago, wondering if maybe, just maybe, it was time to play again.